On the morning of October 12th, 2011, the air in the Red Creek Nature Preserve was crisp and carried the faint, earthy scent of decaying leaves. Two amateur ornithologists, a retired couple named Arthur and Helen Gable, had arrived just after sunrise, hoping to spot a migratory warbler species that was known to pass through the dense Connecticut woodlands during the autumn. They followed a less-traveled deer trail, moving away from the manicured paths and deeper into the preserve's untamed heartland. It was this deviation from the common route that led them to the discovery that would shatter the community's sense of peace. Arthur was the first to see it, a small splash of unnatural color against the muted browns and greens of the forest floor. He pointed it out to Helen, thinking it was perhaps a discarded piece of camping equipment or a lost jacket. As they moved closer, navigating through a thicket of overgrown ferns and tangled underbrush, the object's true nature began to reveal itself with horrifying clarity. What they had mistaken for trash was in fact a human bone, partially unearthed by recent rains and animal activity. The initial shock gave way to a dawning, sickening realization. Looking around the immediate vicinity, they spotted more. The remains were scattered, disturbed by the passage of time and the indifferent cycles of nature. The Gables, shaken but resolute, did not touch anything. They carefully backed away, marking their path so they could lead authorities back to the precise location, and use their mobile phone to make a call that would trigger a complex and ultimately frustrating investigation that would span more than a decade. Within 30 minutes, the quiet solitude of the preserve was broken by the sound of approaching sirens. The first uniformed officers from the Oak Haven Police Department arrived, their expressions grim as the Gables recounted their discovery. The officers followed the couple back to the site, and upon confirming the presence of human remains, they immediately established a perimeter, cordoning off a wide area with bright yellow tape that stood in stark contrast to the natural surroundings. The woods, once a place of quiet recreation, were now a crime scene. Detective Miles Corbin, a veteran of the Oak Haven Homicide Division, was assigned as the lead investigator. He arrived as the morning chill began to fade, finding the initial responding officers standing guard at the perimeter. He was briefed on the situation. A scattered set of skeletal remains, no obvious signs of a campsite or personal belongings, and a location that was both publicly accessible yet remote enough for an act to go unnoticed. Corbin knew from experience that this type of discovery was the beginning of a long and arduous process, a puzzle where most of the pieces were already lost to the elements. The subsequent hours were a methodical and somber affair. The state's forensic anthropology team was called in, their members arriving with specialized equipment designed for the delicate task of excavating and documenting the scene. They worked with painstaking slowness, using small brushes and trowels to gently clear away dirt and leaf litter. Each bone, each fragment, was photographed, measured, and mapped in its exact location before being carefully collected and labeled. The goal was to recover every possible piece of evidence before it could be further disturbed. As the forensic team worked, police officers conducted a grid search of the surrounding area, expanding the perimeter in concentric circles. They looked for anything that might be connected to the remains: clothing, a wallet, a weapon, or any personal effects that might offer a clue to the victim's identity. But the forest floor offered up nothing. The passage of time had either reclaimed or hidden any clues that might have once existed. The perpetrator, it seemed, had left behind only their victim. By nightfall, the recovery operation was complete. The collected remains were transported to the office of the chief medical examiner for analysis. Detective Corbin and his team were left with a crime scene that was now just an empty, taped-off section of woods, and a victim who had no name. The first and most critical step of the investigation was to answer the most fundamental question of all: Who was this person? Without an identity, there could be no search for a motive, and without a motive, there could be no search for a suspect. The medical examiner's office began its work immediately. The initial assessment confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remains belonged to a single individual, and they had likely been in the woods for a significant period of time, estimated to be anywhere from 18 to 24 months. The forensic anthropologist determined the victim was a Caucasian female, likely between the ages of 25 and 35, and stood approximately 5 feet, 6 inches tall. These were crucial details, but they described a vast number of people. The team then focused on the search for identifying features. They meticulously examined the skull, hoping to create a facial reconstruction. They also began the painstaking process of checking the teeth against a national database of dental records for missing persons. This process involved charting every filling, every crown, every unique feature of the victim's dentition, and running it through a system containing thousands of records. It was a slow, methodical search for a perfect match. While the scientific analysis continued, Detective Corbin's team started their own parallel investigation. They began compiling a list of all missing persons reported in Connecticut and neighboring states who fit the general profile provided by the medical examiner. The list was long and daunting. Each name represented a family waiting for answers, and Corbin's team had to approach each case file with the grim possibility that their Jane Doe could be someone's long-lost daughter, sister, or mother. Days turned into weeks. The initial media buzz surrounding the discovery in Red Creek Preserve faded, replaced by other, more current headlines. For the investigators, however, the case remained a constant, pressing weight. They worked through the missing persons files, cross-referencing timelines and physical descriptions. They made dozens of phone calls, speaking with families who had been living in limbo for months or years, asking difficult questions and trying to manage their expectations. Each call that failed to produce a lead was a small but significant disappointment. The first potential breakthrough came nearly a month after the discovery. The dental record search yielded a possible match to a woman who had gone missing from a town over 80 miles away 2 years prior. The records were close, but not perfect. Hope mingled with caution as detectives reached out to the family to request access to the missing woman's full medical records and, if possible, a DNA sample from a close relative for comparison. The family, having endured years of uncertainty, agreed immediately. The wait for the DNA comparison was agonizing. For a few days, it seemed as though Jane Doe might finally have a name. Detectives began to tentatively build a picture of this other missing woman, studying her life and the circumstances of her disappearance. But the results came back negative. The DNA was not a match. The slight discrepancies in the dental records had been significant, after all. The investigation was back to square one, and a family that had been given a brief, painful glimmer of hope was once again left with nothing but questions. Finally, in mid-December, after more than 2 months of exhaustive work, the investigation had its first true breakthrough. A forensic odontologist conducting a final, manual review of records from a different database found a perfect match. The dental records belonged to Eleanor Vance, a 28-year-old graphic designer who had been reported missing from her apartment in the nearby city of Northwood nearly 22 months earlier. Jane Doe had a name. The notification was a somber duty that fell to Detective Corbin. He and a junior detective drove to the suburban home of Eleanor's parents, Martin and Carol Vance. They had lived in a state of suspended grief for almost 2 years, clinging to the fading hope that their daughter had simply left on her own and would one day return. The news from Detective Corbin, while providing a definitive answer, was the confirmation of their deepest fear. Their daughter was gone forever. With the victim now identified, the focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. It was no longer a case about unidentified remains. It was the murder of Eleanor Vance. Detectives immediately pulled her original missing person file, a thick folder filled with old interview notes and reports that had led nowhere. They now had to re-examine every single piece of information within it, but this time through the lens of a homicide investigation. Eleanor Vance, by all accounts, was the type of person who was easy to admire. Friends and family described her as bright, creative, and exceptionally kind. She was a talented graphic designer at a small but successful marketing firm in Northwood, where she was known for her meticulous work ethic and her cheerful, collaborative spirit. She was responsible, financially stable, and had a close-knit group of friends she had known since college. Her parents painted a picture of a devoted daughter who called them every Sunday without fail. Her older brother, David, remembered her as his biggest supporter, someone who was always there to offer encouragement or a listening ear. Her friends spoke of her loyalty and her quiet ambition. She was saving diligently for a down payment on a small condominium, and she dreamed of one day starting her own freelance design business. She did not seem to be the kind of person who would have dangerous enemies. Yet, as investigators delved deeper, a more nuanced portrait of Eleanor began to emerge. While she was overwhelmingly described in positive terms, they did uncover a single, controlled moment of vulnerability. Her best friend, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, told detectives about a conversation they had had a few weeks before Eleanor disappeared. Eleanor had seemed unusually stressed, confiding in Sarah that she was feeling overwhelmed by a demanding project at work, and was also having minor financial anxieties about her goal of buying a home. Sarah had assured her it was normal stress, but she recalled that Eleanor had also made a vague comment about feeling like she was being watched or followed on her walk home from the train station on a couple of occasions. At the time, Sarah had dismissed it as paranoia brought on by her friend's anxiety. Eleanor herself had quickly backtracked, saying she was probably just being silly and overtired. Now, in retrospect, that conversation took on a chilling new significance. Detectives pressed Sarah for more details, but there were none. Eleanor had never mentioned it again. She had not described the person she thought was following her, nor had she reported it to the police. It was a fleeting moment of fear that she had either rationalized away or chosen to keep to herself. This vague hint of a potential stalker became the first real thread for the homicide investigators to pull. The investigation now focused on reconstructing the last 48 hours of Eleanor Vance's life. According to the original missing person report, she was last seen on the evening of Friday, February 19th, 2010. Her colleagues at the marketing firm confirmed she had left the office at her usual time, around 5:30 in the afternoon. She had seemed normal, wishing everyone a good weekend as she walked out the door. From her office, Eleanor typically walked 10 minutes to the Northwood train station, where she would take a 25-minute ride to her stop. From there, it was another 15-minute walk to her apartment complex. This was her daily routine, one she rarely deviated from. Investigators began by canvassing this entire route, looking for any security cameras that might have captured her journey home that evening. The search for video footage proved to be immensely frustrating. In 2010, public surveillance was not as ubiquitous as it would become in later years. The train station had cameras, and detectives were able to locate footage of Eleanor passing through the turnstiles, her expression neutral as she scanned her travel card. This confirmed she had made it to the station. However, there were no working cameras that covered the platform she would have used. They had more luck with a small convenience store located across the street from her apartment complex. The store's exterior camera, though grainy and low resolution, captured a figure matching Eleanor's description walking past at approximately 6:45 in the evening. She was alone and appeared to be walking at a normal pace. This was the last known visual confirmation of Eleanor Vance. It placed her just minutes from the presumed safety of her own home. Eleanor had plans to meet her friend Sarah for brunch that Saturday. When she failed to show up and did not answer her phone, Sarah became worried. By Saturday evening, after her calls and texts had gone unanswered for the entire day, Sarah called Eleanor's parents. Martin Vance drove to his daughter's apartment, using a spare key to let himself in. The apartment was pristine. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of forced entry. Eleanor's purse was on the kitchen counter, containing her wallet with her credit cards and a small amount of cash. Her keys were in a small bowl by the door where she always kept them. Her work clothes from Friday were neatly draped over a chair in her bedroom. The only things that seemed to be missing were her mobile phone and the jacket she had worn home from work. It was as if she had arrived home safely and then simply vanished into thin air. Her parents officially reported her missing on Sunday morning. The initial police response had been thorough, but had classified it as a standard missing person case involving an adult. Without any evidence of foul play, there was a prevailing assumption that she may have left voluntarily. That assumption had now been proven tragically wrong. Homicide detectives returned to the apartment, re-examining it with a fresh, more critical eye. They looked for subtle signs that the original officers might have missed. They used chemical agents to search for latent bloodstains, but found none. They dusted for fingerprints, but the only usable prints belonged to Eleanor, her parents, and her brother. There was no physical evidence to suggest that an unknown person had been inside the apartment. This deepened the mystery. Had she been abducted from the hallway, the parking lot, or had she left willingly with someone she knew and trusted, only to meet with foul play later? The team turned its attention to Eleanor's digital life. They obtained warrants for her phone records. The records showed her phone had received a few texts from friends on Friday evening, all of which went unanswered. The last outgoing communication from her phone was a brief, 2-word text message sent at 7:02 in the evening to a number investigators did not recognize. The message simply said, "On my way." This text message was a seismic development in the case. It suggested that Eleanor had not settled in for the night, but was, in fact, on her way to meet someone shortly after arriving home. The timestamp, 7:02, placed it roughly 17 minutes after she was seen on the convenience store's security camera. This was a narrow window of time, but it was enough for her to have dropped off her purse and keys and left again. The immediate priority was to identify the owner of the number she had texted. The phone company records revealed that the number belonged to a prepaid, disposable burner phone that had been purchased with cash from a department store 2 weeks before Eleanor's disappearance. The phone had been activated on the same day it was purchased. It had been used to make only a handful of calls and texts, all of them to Eleanor Vance. The last activity on the burner phone was receiving Eleanor's "on my way" text. Shortly after that, the phone went dark. It was never used again. Cell tower data showed that when the burner phone received Eleanor's text, it was pinging off a tower that provided coverage to a mixed-use industrial area about 3 miles from her apartment. This was a desolate, poorly lit area of warehouses and small businesses that were mostly closed in the evenings. This discovery painted a sinister picture. Someone had gone to great lengths to communicate with Eleanor anonymously, using an untraceable phone. They had arranged to meet her in a secluded industrial park on a Friday night. She, in turn, had apparently gone to this meeting willingly. This suggested the person was not a stranger, but someone she knew, or at least someone she had been manipulated into trusting. Investigators now had a working theory. Eleanor was not abducted, she was lured. They began to re-interview her friends and family, this time with a new line of questioning. Was Eleanor dating anyone? Had she mentioned meeting someone new? Was there anyone in her life, past or present, who might have a reason to contact her secretly. Her friends were adamant that she was not seriously dating anyone at the time. She had recently ended a casual, month-long relationship with a man named Mark Renner, but the breakup had been amicable. She had complained to Sarah that he was a little boring, but there was no indication of any bad blood between them. Still, protocol demanded they investigate him thoroughly. Detectives located Mark Renner, who was now living in a different state. He was cooperative and seemed genuinely shocked and saddened to learn of Eleanor's death. He provided a detailed account of their brief relationship and confirmed it had ended on friendly terms. More importantly, he had a rock-solid alibi for the night of her disappearance. He had been at a work conference 200 miles away, a fact that was easily verified through receipts and eyewitnesses. Mark Renner was quickly cleared as a person of interest. The investigation then turned to her professional life. Was there anyone at her marketing firm who might have had a conflict with her? Her boss and colleagues were interviewed again. They all described her as a model employee and a positive presence in the office. They could not recall any arguments, professional jealousies, or inappropriate behavior from any coworkers. Her work life appeared to be a dead end. This led detectives back to the vague comments she had made to Sarah about feeling like she was being followed. They re-examined the possibility of a stalker. They combed through her social media accounts, which she used sparingly, looking for any unusual comments or messages. They found nothing. Her online presence was as clean and unremarkable as her real-world one. If someone had developed an obsession with her, they had done so from a distance, leaving no digital trail. The lack of leads was deeply frustrating for Detective Corbin and his team. They had a victim they now knew well, a timeline of her last hours, and a tantalizing but ultimately useless clue in the form of the burner phone. The perpetrator had been disciplined and forensically aware, using an untraceable device and choosing a meeting location that was a virtual black hole in terms of surveillance. Months passed. The active investigation slowed to a crawl. Detectives had exhausted all their immediate leads. They had interviewed dozens of people, analyzed phone records, and scoured financial statements, but they were no closer to identifying the person Eleanor had gone to meet that night. The case was slowly but surely going cold. One of the persistent questions that haunted investigators was the location where Eleanor's body was found. The Red Creek Nature Preserve was nearly 15 miles from the industrial park, where the burner phone had last pinged. This suggested that after meeting the individual, Eleanor had been taken to a secondary location. The preserve was likely not the place where she was killed, but rather the place where her killer had chosen to dispose of her body. The choice of the preserve was itself a clue. It was an area that was well known to locals, suggesting the killer had some familiarity with the Oak Haven area. It was also a place where a body could remain undiscovered for a very long time, which pointed to a degree of cold, calculated planning. The killer was not just trying to hide their crime. They were trying to erase their victim from existence. Forensic analysis of the remains had been unable to determine a precise cause of death. The skeletal remains showed no signs of gunshot wounds, knife marks, or blunt force trauma. While this did not rule out methods like strangulation or poisoning, it meant there was no physical evidence on the bones themselves to indicate how Eleanor had died. This was yet another dead end for the investigation. As the first anniversary of Eleanor's disappearance approached, her family issued a public plea for information. They announced a reward for any tip that led to an arrest, hoping that the promise of money might compel someone who knew something to finally come forward. The local news ran a story on the case, featuring photos of a smiling Eleanor and interviews with her grieving parents. The story generated a handful of tips, but none of them proved to be credible. One tip, however, did lead to a brief and intense period of renewed investigation. A woman called the tip line, claiming that she had seen a car parked on a service road near the entrance to Red Creek Preserve late on a Friday night, around the time Eleanor had disappeared. She remembered it because it was an unusual place to see a car so late, and its headlights had been off. She described the vehicle as a dark-colored, older model sedan. This was the first potential witness account that placed a suspicious vehicle near the disposal site. Detectives interviewed the woman at length. She was sincere, but her memory was fuzzy on the exact date. She was only certain it was a Friday night in the late winter or early spring of 2010. While the time frame was right, the lack of a specific date and a more detailed description of the car made it a difficult lead to pursue. They ran searches for any dark sedans connected to individuals in Eleanor's life, but found nothing. The lead, like all the others, eventually fizzled out. 2 years after Eleanor's body was found, Detective Corbin officially retired. The Vance case was the one that stayed with him, a deep and unresolved source of professional regret. He passed the voluminous case files onto a new generation of detectives, briefing them on every detail, every theory, and every dead end. The case was now formally classified as cold, but it was not forgotten. It remained open, waiting for the one piece of evidence, or the one witness that could break it open. Over the next several years, the case would be periodically reviewed. New forensic techniques became available, and in 2015, the few trace evidence samples that had been collected from the crime scene were resubmitted for more advanced DNA analysis. Detectives hoped that this new, more sensitive technology might be able to isolate a microscopic trace of the killer's DNA. But the results came back the same as before. The only DNA profile present was Eleanor's. The case also became a subject of interest for online communities of amateur sleuths. They dissected every known detail, proposing theories that ranged from the plausible to the wildly speculative. Some believed the killer was a secret lover Eleanor's friends and family knew nothing about. Others suggested it was a co-worker whose professional jealousy had turned violent. A more pervasive theory centered on the idea that Eleanor had stumbled upon some form of criminal activity and had been silenced. While these online discussions kept Eleanor's memory alive, they produced no actionable leads for law enforcement. The theories were built on speculation, not evidence. The core of the problem remained the same. The killer had been a ghost. They had entered Eleanor's life, lured her to her death, and then vanished without leaving a single trace that could be tied to a real person. In 2018, a new detective assigned to the cold case unit, Detective Isabella Rossi, decided to take a completely fresh look at the entire file. She spent months reading every interview transcript, every lab report, and every handwritten note from the original investigation. She was struck by the calculated precision of the crime, the use of a burner phone, the choice of a meeting location with no surveillance, and the remote disposal site all pointed to a perpetrator who was not an impulsive amateur. Detective Rossi became convinced that the key was in understanding the why. What could have been the motive? A crime of passion usually left behind evidence of rage. A robbery would have made no sense, as Eleanor was not wealthy, and her valuables were left in her apartment. This led Rossi to focus on the theory of a targeted, predatory killer who had likely selected Eleanor for specific reasons. She revisited the idea of the stalker, the fleeting fear Eleanor had expressed to her friend. Rossi theorized that the killer might be someone who existed on the periphery of Eleanor's life. A person she saw on her daily commute, a customer at a coffee shop she frequented, or a resident in her large apartment complex. This person could have observed her for weeks or months, learning her routines and constructing a plan. This theory was compelling, but it was also almost impossible to investigate so many years after the fact. How could you identify a phantom who had existed only in the background of a person's life? Rossi's team attempted to reconstruct a more detailed picture of Eleanor's daily habits, interviewing old neighbors and the owners of shops she used to visit. But memories had faded, and no one could recall anyone paying an unusual amount of attention to Eleanor. One avenue Rossi explored was the possibility that the burner phone was not as untraceable as originally thought. She worked with federal partners to re-examine the phone's purchase history. They tracked the sale of that specific batch of phones, trying to see if any others purchased at the same time and place could be linked to a known individual. It was a long shot, a search for a needle in a haystack of anonymous cash transactions. After weeks of work, the effort yielded nothing. The investigation also re-examined the text message, "On my way." The wording was simple, but it implied a pre-arranged plan. It was not the kind of message one would send to a stranger. It suggested a degree of familiarity and expectation. Rossi believed this supported the theory that the killer had managed to build some level of trust with Eleanor before luring her to the meeting. How could a careful, responsible person like Eleanor be manipulated into meeting a near stranger in an industrial park at night? Rossi speculated that the killer might have used a clever pretext. Perhaps they had posed as a potential freelance client with an urgent project. Or maybe they had created a false identity online, building a rapport with her over time before suggesting a meeting. But a deep dive into her computer, which had been seized in 2010, showed no evidence of any such communications. If a relationship had been built, it had been done through the untraceable burner phone. The case of Eleanor Vance became a quiet fixture in the Oak Haven Police Department. It was a teaching case for new detectives, an example of a perfectly executed crime where the perpetrator's discipline had defeated the investigation at every turn. It was a reminder of the limits of police work when confronted with a meticulous and forensically aware adversary. For Eleanor's family, the passage of time did not bring healing, only a dull, persistent ache of unresolved loss. They had buried their daughter, but they could not find peace. The knowledge that the person responsible for her death was still free was a burden they carried every day. They stopped giving interviews, retreating from the public eye to grieve in private. The reward they had offered went unclaimed, and eventually the fund was quietly closed. The Red Creek Nature Preserve continued to be a popular spot for hikers and birdwatchers. A small, unofficial memorial of painted stones was sometimes placed near the area where Eleanor's remains were found, but park rangers would periodically clear it away. Over time, new visitors to the preserve were unaware of the dark secret that a small section of its woods held. The forest had reclaimed the site, and nature's indifference had erased the scars of the crime scene. Detective Rossi, like Detective Corbin before her, eventually moved on to other cases, though she never fully let go of the Vance investigation. She kept a photo of Eleanor pinned to the corkboard in her cubicle, a silent promise that she had not been forgotten. On slow days, she would sometimes pull out the old case files, reading through them one more time, hoping to see a detail she had missed, a connection that had been overlooked. But the connection was never there. The case remains open to this day, a silent testament to a life cut tragically short, and a quest for justice that was met with a cold, unbreachable wall of silence. The identity of the person who bought the burner phone, sent the texts, and met Eleanor on that cold February night is a secret known only to them. They succeeded in committing what was, for all intents and purposes, the perfect murder. The investigation had built a profile of this unknown subject. They were patient, organized, and methodical. They were likely familiar with the Northwood and Oak Haven areas. They possessed the social intelligence to gain Eleanor's trust and the cold-blooded ruthlessness to take her life and dispose of her body with chilling efficiency. They were a predator hiding in plain sight, a ghost in the machine of everyday life. But this profile was just a collection of inferences, a specter constructed from the absence of evidence. It had no name, no face, and no history. The person who killed Eleanor Vance could be anyone, They could be a neighbor, a coworker, a stranger. They have lived for more than a decade with the knowledge of what they did, their secret held safe by their own careful planning and a distinct lack of luck on the part of the investigators. The story of Eleanor Vance is not one of clever deductions and a dramatic courtroom conclusion. It is a somber narrative about the painful reality of some criminal investigations. It is about how a person can do everything right, be kind, work hard, love their family, and plan for the future, and still fall victim to a darkness that appears without warning and vanishes without a trace. Her legacy is one of unanswered questions. What were the final moments of her life like? Did she realize the danger she was in? And the most haunting question of all, the one that lingers in the minds of the detectives and her family. Why? Without a suspect, there can be no motive. The reason for her murder is as much a mystery as the murderer themselves. Today, the physical case files, boxes of paper reports, interview transcripts, and crime scene photographs are stored in the police department's evidence archives. Her digital file exists on a secure server. They are monuments to a massive, multi-year effort that, despite the dedication of dozens of officers and forensic specialists, ultimately failed to provide the answers her loved ones deserved. The case stands as a stark reminder that justice is not always inevitable. Sometimes the wicked go unpunished. Sometimes the questions are never answered. And sometimes a young woman with a bright future ahead of her can walk out of her apartment on a Friday night to meet someone and never be seen alive again, leaving behind only a ghost of a killer and a silence that echoes through the years. The tragedy of Eleanor Vance is twofold. There is the initial, brutal tragedy of her murder, the violent theft of her future. But there is also the secondary, lingering tragedy of the unknown. Her family and friends have been denied the closure that comes with knowing who was responsible and why. They are left to wonder, to speculate, and to carry the weight of a story without an ending. The few clues that were discovered, the burner phone, the meeting in the industrial park, the disposal site in the nature preserve, are like pieces from different puzzles. They hint at a larger picture, but they do not fit together to form a coherent image. The person who held all the other pieces, the one who could connect them all, has remained in the shadows, a specter of unresolved justice. And so the file on the murder of Eleanor Vance remains open, a cold case waiting for a break that with each passing year seems less and less likely to ever come. The ultimate failure of the investigation was not for a lack of effort. The police had pursued every possible angle, from jilted lovers to professional rivals, from random predators to acquaintances with a hidden grudge. They had utilized the best forensic technology of their time and had revisited the evidence as that technology evolved. They had followed the logical paths of deduction and had entertained the more speculative theories. In the end, every path led to the same place, a dead end. The perpetrator had successfully insulated themselves from the investigation through a series of careful, deliberate choices. The decision to use a disposable phone purchased with cash was the first and most critical step. This one action effectively severed the primary link between them and their victim. Without a name attached to that phone, the digital trail that is so often the key to solving modern crimes went cold before it even began. The choice of the meeting location was equally calculated. The industrial park was a place with a legitimate reason for vehicles to be present, but it was devoid of the kind of pedestrian traffic or residential surveillance that might have produced an eyewitness. It was a transitional space, a non-place where a crime could be initiated without drawing attention. The perpetrator knew not only how to contact their victim, but where to do so with the lowest possible risk of being seen. Finally, the choice of the Red Creek Nature Preserve as a disposal site demonstrated a chilling degree of local knowledge and forethought. The perpetrator did not panic and leave the body in a place of convenience. They transported their victim 15 miles to a location where nature itself would become an accomplice in concealing the crime. The months that passed before the remains were discovered ensured that most, if not all, of the transient forensic evidence, fibers, hair, DNA on the body, would be destroyed by weather and wildlife. These three elements, the untraceable communication, the secluded meeting point, and the remote disposal site, formed a triangle of criminal methodology that proved impossible for law enforcement to penetrate. The person who killed Eleanor Vance had not simply gotten lucky. They had planned their actions with a level of care and precision that was deeply unsettling to the seasoned detectives who worked the case. This level of planning also complicated the process of creating a motive. It seemed too elaborate for a simple, impulsive act of violence. It suggested a deeper, more personal reason for the crime. Yet the investigation into Eleanor's life had revealed no one who held the kind of intense grudge that would warrant such a meticulous and brutal act. This paradox was at the heart of the case's stagnation. The crime felt personal, but the victim's life was devoid of personal conflict. This led some investigators, particularly in the later cold case reviews, to consider a more disturbing possibility. Perhaps the motive was not personal to Eleanor at all. Perhaps she was simply the target of a predator who enjoyed the process itself. The stalking, the planning, the execution, and the aftermath of a successful, unsolved crime. In this scenario, the meticulous planning was not just a means to an end, but the entire point of the exercise. This theory, while speculative, accounted for the lack of any discernible connection between Eleanor and a potential killer. The perpetrator could have been a complete stranger who selected her at random and then spent weeks or months learning her habits before initiating contact. They could have been a budding serial killer testing their methods, with Eleanor being their first and perhaps only victim. This possibility was terrifying, as it meant the killer could still be anywhere, having never been connected to any other crime. The case of Eleanor Vance thus serves as a chilling illustration of the vulnerabilities that exist even in a safe and structured life. She lived in a secure apartment, worked in a professional environment, and maintained a stable and healthy social circle. She did nothing to invite danger, and yet danger found her. It found her through a channel of communication she thought was safe, and it exploited her trust in a way that led her to her doom. The finality of the mystery is perhaps the most somber aspect of the entire affair. With no new leads, no new witnesses, and no new forensic breakthroughs on the horizon, the probability of the case ever being solved diminishes with each passing day. The person who killed Eleanor Vance has likely grown older, their secret buried deeper with the years. They have been granted a life that they denied to their victim, a life of freedom built upon a foundation of unpunished violence. The memory of Eleanor is now preserved primarily by those who loved her. Her parents, now in their late 70s, still live in the same house, a home filled with photographs and memories of their daughter. Her brother, David, has children of his own now, children who will only know their aunt through the stories their father tells them. Her friend, Sarah, is left with the haunting memory of that last, seemingly insignificant conversation, forever wondering if she should have pressed Eleanor harder about her fears of being followed. These are the unseen, enduring consequences of the crime. The investigation may have gone cold, and the public may have forgotten her name, but for the people who constituted Eleanor's world, the loss remains acute. The absence of justice is a wound that can never fully close. It is a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of their lives, a reminder of what they lost and what they were never given. An answer. The story ends where it began, in the quiet woods of the Red Creek Nature Preserve. The deer trails are still there, the leaves still turn color and fall each autumn, and the cycles of nature continue, indifferent to the human tragedy that once unfolded there. The bones have long since been removed, but the place holds a silent, invisible weight. It is a place where a secret is buried, not beneath the soil, but in the unwritten history of the land itself. The secret of who brought Eleanor Vance there and why they were never brought to justice. If you found this case compelling, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on similar true crime investigations. Until next time, stay aware, stay compassionate, and look out for one another.